Imagine opening your eyes beneath the towering canopy of the Amazon rainforest on Christmas morning, with no memory of how the sky became the ground beneath you. It sounds like the opening line of a novel, yet the historical record suggests it happened to a 17-year-old girl named Julianne Koepke on December 25, 1971. By the time this story reaches its end, you will understand how a teenager became the sole known survivor of Lanza Flight 508. Why she awoke alone beneath one of the world's most challenging rainforests after falling from approximately 10,000 feet while still attached to a row of airplane seats, and how she would spend 11 extraordinary days following waterways through the Peruvian Amazon before finally encountering other people. Even today, investigators, historians, journalists, and scientists continue to study the remarkable sequence of events surrounding her survival. Some questions have convincing answers supported by evidence. Others remain surrounded by uncertainty. Where the historical record is incomplete, it is important to distinguish between documented fact and later interpretation. What is known with confidence is extraordinary enough without embellishment. On Christmas Day in 1971, somewhere beneath the dense green canopy of the Peruvian Amazon, Julianne Koepke slowly opened her eyes. Above her, towering trees filtered the tropical sunlight into scattered beams that barely reached the forest floor. The sounds around her were unfamiliar to most people, yet not entirely foreign to her. Insects hummed without pause. Birds called from high above. Moist air carried the unmistakable scent of wet vegetation and earth after seasonal rain. For a brief moment, nothing seemed to fit together. She was no longer inside an airplane. She was no longer traveling with her mother. She was completely alone. Later accounts describe Julianne gradually recognizing that she was still alive, even though she could not immediately understand how she had reached the forest below. The available evidence indicates that she remained attached to a section of 3 passenger seats when she descended into the rainforest, an unusual circumstance that has been discussed extensively by aviation specialists and survival researchers. Exactly how every force interacted during those final moments has never been determined with complete certainty, but investigators agreed that several uncommon factors likely combined to produce an outcome few believe possible. At that moment beneath the trees, however, Julianne knew none of those discussions. She faced only one undeniable reality. There was no sign of the aircraft. No rescue team stood nearby. No familiar voice answered when she looked around. The immense Amazon surrounded her in every direction, stretching far beyond anything she could see. For many people, this environment represented one of the most difficult landscapes on Earth. Dense rainforest, winding rivers, unpredictable weather, countless plant species, and extraordinary biodiversity created a world that could overwhelm even experienced travelers. Yet Julianne possessed something unusually rare. Long before that Christmas morning, the rainforest had already become part of her family's life. That fact would eventually matter more than anyone could have imagined. To understand why Julianne was there, we must return less than 24 hours earlier, to Christmas Eve in Lima, Peru. December 24th, 1971, began with anticipation rather than fear. Families throughout Peru prepared for Christmas celebrations. Airports welcomed travelers hoping to reunite with loved ones before the holiday. Among them were 17-year-old Julianne Koepke and her mother, Maria Koepke, a respected ornithologist whose scientific work had taken the family deep into Peru's remarkable ecosystems. Their destination was Pucallpa, where Julianne's father, Hans Wilhelm Koepke, was waiting. From there, the family planned to continue toward Panguana Biological Station, a research center they had helped establish within the Amazon rainforest. Panguana was far more than a workplace. It represented years of scientific dedication to understanding tropical ecosystems, documenting wildlife, and preserving one of the planet's richest natural environments. Julianne had spent much of her childhood exposed to this world of biology, observation, and careful respect for nature. While other teenagers might have viewed the rainforest as mysterious or intimidating, She had learned from an early age that every plant, every bird, every insect, and every stream formed part of a larger ecological system. Those lessons were never intended as survival training. They were simply part of growing up in a family devoted to science. Even so, the knowledge accumulated over years of exploration would later become unexpectedly valuable. Historical photographs from the period show Julianne as a thoughtful young woman with long dark hair and a quiet expression, standing beside parents whose professional lives centered on understanding the natural world. Maria Koepke had earned international respect for her work in ornithology, while Hans Wilhelm Koepke had conducted extensive research on Peru's ecosystems. Together, they built not only scientific careers, but also a family life closely connected to the rainforest. Their Christmas journey seemed routine compared with many previous trips they had made between Lima and the Amazon region. The available evidence indicates that Julianne and Maria boarded Lanza Flight 508, expecting to celebrate the holiday with Hans Wilhelm after arriving in Pucallpa. Like countless holiday travelers, they carried plans rather than apprehension. The promise of reunion lay ahead. Christmas traditions awaited. Scientific work at Panguana would continue after the holiday. Nothing publicly documented suggests they believed this journey would become one of the most widely remembered survival stories in aviation history. As passengers settled into their seats, conversations likely reflected ordinary holiday travel, though investigators could not determine the content of those private moments with certainty. Responsible historical storytelling requires acknowledging that limitation. We know where they were going. We know why they were traveling. We know who waited for them. Beyond that, the historical record becomes appropriately cautious. What followed during the flight would change Julianne's life forever and leave investigators examining one of aviation history's most remarkable survival cases. Yet even after decades of research, not every detail can be reconstructed with complete confidence. Some questions remain unanswered. Others are supported only by partial evidence. What cannot be disputed is what came afterward. A 17-year-old who expected to spend Christmas with her family instead found herself alone beneath the towering rainforest canopy, separated from every certainty she had known only hours before. The challenge before her was almost impossible to comprehend. She did not know precisely where she was. She did not know how far she might be from help. She did not know whether anyone else had reached the forest. Most importantly, she could not know that the decisions she would make over the coming days would become the reason millions of people around the world would one day remember her name. The Amazon had become both her greatest obstacle and, in unexpected ways, her only guide. And somewhere beyond the endless trees, rivers, and dense vegetation, the path that would eventually lead back to humanity had already begun, even though Julianne herself could not yet see it. Hours before Julianne Koepke found herself alone beneath the towering trees of the Peruvian Amazon, her life had followed a path that seemed destined for science rather than survival. She had grown up in a family where curiosity about the natural world was part of everyday life. Her mother, Maria Koepke, had earned recognition as an ornithologist whose research focused on the remarkable diversity of bird species found throughout Peru. Her father, Hans Wilhelm Koepke, was a zoologist whose work explored the relationships between animals, ecosystems, and the extraordinary environments of South America. Together, they believed that understanding nature required more than occasional expeditions. It required living close enough to observe the rainforest through every season, every cycle, and every subtle change that could never be appreciated during a brief visit. That vision eventually led them to establish Panguana Biological Station within the Peruvian Amazon, creating a place where scientific observation could continue over many years. The station became both a research center and a family home away from Lima, allowing Julianne to experience a childhood unlike that of most teenagers. While many students spent vacations in cities or at the beach, Julianne often found herself surrounded by towering trees, winding streams, and an astonishing variety of wildlife. Those experiences shaped the way she understood the rainforest. She learned that every sound carried information. Different birds announced the changing hours of the day. Rivers revealed the shape of the land. Weather patterns could shift quickly, requiring careful observation rather than assumption. The rainforest demanded respect because it rewarded preparation and punished carelessness. It was not an unknowable wilderness to those willing to study it patiently. According to later interviews and Julianne's own memoir, her parents encouraged careful observation instead of fear. They taught her to notice details before making conclusions. Plants were not simply background scenery, but living organisms with distinct characteristics. Animals followed patterns that could often be understood through patient attention. Rivers served not only as sources of water, but also as natural pathways through terrain that otherwise became almost impossible to cross. Orientation depended on recognizing landscapes instead of relying upon roads or signs. None of these lessons resembled formal survival instruction. They reflected the habits of scientists who believed that knowledge began with observation. Julianne absorbed those habits almost without realizing it. At school in Lima, however, her daily life appeared much like that of other students her age. She balanced academic responsibilities with ordinary teenage experiences while remaining closely connected to her parents' scientific work. December of 1971 marked an especially important milestone because she had recently completed her school graduation. The family looked forward to celebrating both Christmas and this achievement together. Hans Wilhelm was already at Panguana, continuing research responsibilities that required his presence in the rainforest. Julianne and Maria planned to join him after flying from Lima to Pucallpa. Before continuing onward, everything about the journey reflected familiar routines established through years of travel between the capital and Peru's Amazon region. Historical records indicate that travel arrangements changed shortly before departure because available flights during the busy Christmas period were limited. Later reporting has discussed the circumstances surrounding the airline selection, but responsible historical analysis requires caution. Although LANSA had experienced previous operational difficulties that were known publicly at the time, historians emphasize that evaluating decisions made before an event should not be confused with judging them through the benefit of hindsight. The available evidence indicates that Julianne and Maria accepted seats on Flight 508 as part of their effort to reach Hans Wilhelm before Christmas celebrations. Nothing in the historical record suggests they expected the journey to become extraordinary. Airports during holiday seasons often combine excitement with urgency. Travelers hurry between counters carrying wrapped gifts, luggage, and expectations of reunion. Families look forward to celebrations waiting just beyond the final destination. Julianne and Maria were no different. They anticipated seeing Hans Wilhelm again at Panguana, where scientific work and family traditions naturally blended together. The rainforest that surrounded the biological station was already deeply familiar to Julianne. She understood that the Amazon could appear overwhelming to newcomers because of its immense scale. Covering millions of acres across several countries, it contained countless waterways, dense vegetation, and extraordinary biological diversity. Yet she also knew that the forest followed its own patterns. Streams often connected to larger rivers. Animal activity changed according to the time of day. Heavy rainfall could transform familiar paths within hours. Knowledge of these rhythms did not eliminate danger, but it reduced uncertainty. Those ideas remained quietly stored in her memory, acquired gradually over years of accompanying her parents rather than through dramatic lessons. Maria's influence reached beyond scientific facts. As an accomplished ornithologist, she demonstrated that careful observation required patience, discipline, and respect for evidence. Conclusions were earned rather than assumed. Hans Wilhelm approached zoology with similar principles, encouraging thoughtful examination instead of quick judgment. Their daughter grew up surrounded by notebooks, field observations, specimens, maps, and conversations centered upon discovery. Scientific thinking became part of everyday family life. Looking back decades later, Julianne would often describe how ordinary these experiences felt at the time. She did not view herself as someone receiving unusual preparation. She was simply living within the environment her parents had chosen because they believed the rainforest deserved careful study and long-term conservation. That perspective would later distinguish her responses from what many observers might expect under extraordinary circumstances. Practical knowledge developed over many years often becomes instinctive. A person may not consciously recall every lesson, yet still apply it when necessary. Whether recognizing the importance of waterways, understanding how dense forest limits visibility, or appreciating that unnecessary risks can quickly multiply, Julianne carried habits shaped by science rather than adventure. None of this guaranteed survival. The historical record does not support the idea that knowledge alone explains what happened after Flight 508. Researchers generally agree that multiple uncommon factors combined over the following days, including circumstance, resilience, and decisions made under immense uncertainty. Even so, the foundation built during childhood undeniably formed part of the larger story. As Christmas Eve continued, passengers gradually boarded the aircraft bound for Pucallpa. Some traveled for family reunions. Others journeyed for work or holiday celebrations. Julianne and Maria took their seats, expecting that within a relatively short time, they would once again see Hans Wilhelm waiting in the Amazon, ready to celebrate Christmas together before returning to research at Panguana. The promise of that reunion remained vivid. Neither mother nor daughter could have known that the flight would soon place Julianne in circumstances unlike any ever imagined, with the quiet lessons learned from years among rivers, forests, animals. Changing weather and careful observation would become the only familiar guide she still possessed. As LANSA Flight 508 departed Lima on the afternoon of December 24, 1971, the journey appeared to be another routine holiday flight connecting Peru's capital with the Amazon city of Pucallpa. The cabin reflected the atmosphere common to Christmas Eve travel. Families looked forward to reunions. Travelers carried expectations that by nightfall they would be celebrating with relatives and friends. Julianne Coep sat beside her mother, Maria Coep, sharing a trip they had made before as they prepared to reunite with Hans Wilhelm Coep at Panguana Biological Station. For Julianne, the excitement of having recently completed school blended naturally with the anticipation of spending Christmas surrounded once again by the rainforest that had become such a familiar part of her life. Nothing in the historical record suggests that mother or daughter believed this flight would become one of the most closely examined aviation events in modern history. As the aircraft continued eastward from Lima toward the Peruvian Amazon, the landscape below gradually transformed. Mountain terrain gave way to the vast tropical basin, where countless rivers wound through uninterrupted forest stretching beyond the horizon. Weather over the Amazon could change rapidly, especially during the rainy season, and experienced pilots operating in the region understood that developing storm systems required careful attention. The official investigation later examined numerous operational and environmental factors surrounding the flight, yet investigators could not determine every detail with complete certainty. What remains well documented is that the aircraft eventually encountered severe weather while approaching the Amazon region. Later accounts from Julianne consistently describe increasingly intense turbulence accompanied by lightning. Outside the aircraft, those descriptions have remained remarkably consistent across interviews conducted over many decades. Passengers who had boarded expecting an ordinary holiday journey suddenly found themselves inside an aircraft, moving through increasingly unstable conditions. The available evidence indicates that the flight entered an area of significant storm activity. Beyond that broad conclusion, specialists continue to distinguish between confirmed findings and speculation. Responsible historical storytelling requires preserving that distinction rather than filling unanswered questions with dramatic assumptions. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere changed as conditions outside became more turbulent. Objects no longer rested as steadily as they had earlier in the flight. The motion of the aircraft became increasingly noticeable. Bright flashes illuminated the windows at irregular intervals as lightning appeared within the surrounding storm clouds. Julianne would later recall seeing lightning immediately before the sequence of events that transformed her life forever. Her recollections have become one of the most frequently cited first-hand descriptions of those final moments because they provide a rare perspective from someone who survived. Even so, memory itself has limitations, particularly after an event involving sudden disorientation. Historians therefore compare personal testimony with investigative records whenever possible, recognizing that both contribute valuable pieces to the historical picture. Maria remained seated beside her daughter as the aircraft continued through the storm. Beyond that basic fact, the historical record becomes appropriately silent regarding any private exchange between them. No reliable source preserves a final conversation, and it would be inaccurate to invent one. Their shared destination is well documented. Their shared commitment to joining Hans Wilhelm for Christmas at Panguana is equally well established. Those facts alone carry sufficient emotional weight without placing imagined words into their final moments together aboard the flight. Outside, towering storm clouds continued to dominate the sky. Within moments, the situation changed with extraordinary speed. Investigators later concluded that a sequence of events occurred during the aircraft's passage through the severe weather that ultimately led to its in-flight breakup. The precise interaction of every contributing factor has remained the subject of technical analysis for decades, and responsible accounts avoid presenting uncertain mechanisms as established fact. What can be stated confidently is that the aircraft no longer remained intact. Julianne later described an abrupt transition from sitting inside the cabin to finding herself no longer surrounded by the enclosed space of the airplane. According to her recollections and the available evidence, she remained attached to a row of passenger seats as she descended. That detail has become one of the most extraordinary aspects of the entire story because it has been supported by both her testimony and subsequent investigation. Exactly how the attached seats influenced the descent has generated discussion among researchers, yet investigators could not determine with certainty every aerodynamic effect involved. The record suggests only that several unusual circumstances combined in a manner almost impossible to predict. For Julianne herself, there was no opportunity to analyze what was happening. The familiar boundaries of the aircraft disappeared, replaced by open sky, powerful wind, and an experience that defied ordinary human expectation. Later accounts describe a rapid sequence of fragmented impressions rather than a continuous narrative. Historians generally recognize that such memories are consistent with the confusion often associated with highly unusual events. Time itself may have seemed distorted. Individual moments became impossible to separate clearly. Somewhere far below stretched one of the largest rainforests on Earth, its immense canopy appearing from above as an almost unbroken expanse of green. Few people who looked down upon the Amazon from an aircraft ever imagined reaching it, except through a normal landing many miles away. Julianne's circumstances were unlike anything anticipated by aviation training manuals or ordinary travel experience. The available evidence indicates that she continued descending while still connected to the row of seats, rotating through open air before approaching the forest canopy. Later scientific discussions have proposed several possible explanations for why her descent unfolded differently than might otherwise have been expected, including the potential influence of the attached seats and the dense layers of vegetation below. None of those explanations can be confirmed in every detail, and investigators ultimately acknowledged that certain aspects could not be reconstructed with complete certainty. That uncertainty has remained part of the historical record, rather than a gap to be filled with speculation. As the distance between Julianne and the rainforest steadily closed, the immense canopy beneath her expanded until individual treetops became distinguishable. The forest she had known through years of scientific fieldwork with her parents no longer appeared as a distant landscape viewed from above, but as an overwhelming sea of towering vegetation rising to meet her. Somewhere within that vast wilderness lay rivers, streams, vines, countless species of plants and animals, and the research station where her father waited, unaware that events unfolding high above the forest had already changed everything. Julianne could not know whether anyone else remained nearby. She could not know where she would ultimately come to rest. She could not know that historians, scientists, journalists, and millions of people around the world would spend decades trying to understand the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this moment. Later accounts describe her memory fading as the rainforest rushed closer, until conscious awareness slipped away completely. When she would next open her eyes, there would be no cabin, no familiar voices, and no visible sign of the journey that had begun in Lima only hours earlier. Only the endless green canopy of the Amazon waiting in silence around her. When Julianne Coep regained consciousness on Christmas Day, 1971, the first reality she encountered was not silence but sound. The rainforest was already alive around her. Birds called from high above the canopy. Frogs echoed from unseen pools of water. Countless insects produced an almost continuous chorus that filled every space between the towering trees. Moist air carried the scent of wet leaves and rich soil, while occasional drops of rain continued falling through layers of branches overhead. Years later, Julianne would describe recognizing those sounds almost immediately because they belonged to an environment she had known since childhood. Although the circumstances were beyond comprehension, the forest itself was strangely familiar. According to her memoir and later interviews, she did not immediately understand how she had arrived there. The available evidence indicates that the sequence of events between her descent through the storm and the moment she opened her eyes remained fragmented in her memory. Like many survivors of highly unusual events, her recollections contained clear moments separated by gaps that could never be completely reconstructed. What she did understand was that she was no longer inside an aircraft and that no one else was immediately visible nearby. She gradually became aware of her surroundings. Dense vegetation extended in every direction. Towering trees blocked most direct sunlight, creating a dim green landscape beneath the canopy. The forest floor was uneven, covered with fallen leaves, branches, and countless living plants adapted to the humid tropical environment. Looking upward revealed only layers of vegetation rather than open sky. Even during daylight, visibility remained surprisingly limited because the rainforest concealed distance behind overlapping growth. Julianne soon realized that one detail from her ordinary life had suddenly become an unexpected obstacle. Her eyeglasses were gone. Nearsighted since childhood, she depended upon them for clear vision. Without them, distant objects became blurred, making orientation considerably more difficult inside an already confusing landscape. Later accounts consistently mention the loss of her glasses as one of the practical challenges she faced almost immediately. She also discovered that only one sandal remained on her foot while the other had disappeared. These details may appear small compared with a larger historical event, yet they reveal how quickly familiar routines can vanish under extraordinary circumstances. Everyday objects that usually receive little attention suddenly become important when they are no longer available. The historical record indicates that Julianne also noticed several physical effects of what had happened, but responsible accounts avoid exaggeration. Contemporary reporting, medical observations, and her own memoir describe injuries that, while significant, allowed her to remain mobile. She later recalled bruising, cuts, and a shoulder injury, among other difficulties, yet the available evidence indicates that she remained capable of walking. Historians have often remarked that this ability proved essential because remaining completely immobile deep within the rainforest would likely have created very different circumstances. Julianne herself did not possess a complete understanding of her condition at that moment. She simply recognized what she could and could not do and responded accordingly. Looking around the immediate area, she searched for signs that someone else might also be nearby. The available evidence suggests that she called out and listened for any response, but the rainforest answered only with its own natural sounds. No familiar voices reached her through the dense vegetation. No immediate sign indicated where the aircraft had come to rest. The enormous scale of the Amazon made even short distances difficult to judge because visibility was limited by layers of trees and undergrowth. Someone could theoretically be relatively close, yet completely hidden from view. Julianne therefore continued searching the area around her as best she could. Historical accounts describe her finding only a very small number of useful items nearby. Unlike fictional survival stories where supplies conveniently appear, the documented evidence suggests that she possessed almost nothing that could significantly improve her situation. She could rely primarily upon the knowledge already stored in her memory, rather than equipment. That distinction would shape every decision that followed. Time passed, and the absence of other people became increasingly apparent. Waiting for immediate rescue may have seemed like the natural choice, yet Julianne's upbringing had quietly prepared her to evaluate the environment differently. Throughout childhood at Panguana Biological Station, her parents had shared practical observations about how the rainforest functioned. These lessons were never presented as dramatic survival rules. Instead, they reflected ordinary scientific understanding of geography and ecology. One principle remained especially important. Water moves downhill. Small streams gradually join larger streams. Larger streams eventually connect with rivers. Rivers, in turn, often become the natural routes along which people travel, transport supplies, establish camps, or build settlements within the Amazon. This understanding did not guarantee rescue, but it offered direction where none otherwise existed. Later accounts describe Julianne remembering this practical knowledge as she considered what to do next. Rather than wandering randomly through dense forest, following flowing water offered a strategy grounded in the landscape itself. It reduced unnecessary uncertainty by allowing the terrain to provide a consistent guide. The record suggests that this reasoning reflected habits learned from years accompanying her parents during scientific work rather than a sudden inspiration created by crisis. Scientific observation had taught her to look for dependable natural patterns before making decisions. Rivers represented one of the most dependable patterns the rainforest offered. Before beginning to move, Julianne continued scanning the surrounding area for any indication that help might already be approaching. She listened carefully, aware that unfamiliar mechanical sounds or human voices would stand apart from the ordinary rhythms of the forest. None appeared. The rainforest remained immense, beautiful, and indifferent. Every passing hour reduced the likelihood that remaining in exactly the same place would quickly solve her situation. The available evidence indicates that she eventually located a small stream. To someone unfamiliar with Amazon geography, it might have appeared insignificant, little more than water threading quietly through vegetation. To Julianne, however, it represented something far more meaningful. It provided orientation in a landscape where landmarks constantly repeated themselves. She understood that resisting the natural flow of the land would require endless guesswork, while following the stream allowed geography itself to become a guide. The decision reflected practical reasoning supported by experience rather than certainty about the outcome. She could not know how many miles lay ahead. She could not know where the water would eventually lead. She could not know whether anyone would ever see her. Yet the available evidence indicates that she chose movement over passive waiting because the rainforest itself suggested a direction. Carrying almost nothing, seeing imperfectly without her glasses, wearing only one remaining sandal, and surrounded by one of the most biologically complex environments on Earth, Julianne began following the flowing water, unaware that this simple decision would become one of the defining choices in one of history's most extraordinary documented survival stories. The small stream became Julianne Coep's only reliable guide as the first full days in the Peruvian Amazon unfolded. She did not know how many miles separated her from the nearest settlement, whether organized search teams were close or far away, or even where the remains of the aircraft had come to rest in relation to her position. The rainforest concealed distance with remarkable efficiency. A location that appeared nearby could require hours of careful movement to reach, while familiar sounds often echoed through the dense vegetation in ways that made direction difficult to judge. Rather than attempting to force a path through the thick forest without reference points, the available evidence indicates that Julianne remained committed to following flowing water, relying upon the practical lessons her parents had shared over many years at Panguana Biological Station. During this early stage of her journey, the historical record suggests that she discovered a small supply of candy near part of the scattered wreckage. Later accounts consistently mention that the candy became one of the few sources of food available to her during the opening days. It was not enough to remove the uncertainty of her situation, but it provided limited energy while requiring no preparation. Unlike dramatic fictional survival stories that often introduce conveniently abundant supplies, Julianne's documented experience remained defined by scarcity. Every small advantage mattered because there was almost nothing else upon which she could rely. Water presented a different situation. The stream flowing beside her offered a continuous source of drinking water. Years later, Julianne explained that following waterways was not simply a matter of finding direction. The streams themselves were part of the environment her parents had taught her to understand. Small creeks eventually joined larger waterways, and larger waterways increased the likelihood of human activity somewhere downstream. Although no guarantee existed, rivers had long served as natural travel routes throughout the Amazon basin. The decision reflected practical geographical knowledge rather than optimism alone. Each step carried her toward a possibility instead of leaving her motionless in an unknown location. Progress, however, came slowly. Without her eyeglasses, distant features remained blurred. The loss of one sandal made every stretch of uneven ground more difficult to cross. Fallen branches, exposed roots, mud, and dense vegetation forced her to move carefully rather than quickly. The rainforest floor constantly reminded visitors that speed often mattered less than balance. A hurried step could easily become an unnecessary mistake. The available evidence indicates that Julianne adjusted her pace accordingly, conserving energy while continuing to follow the stream whenever possible. Rain arrived frequently, as expected during the Amazon wet season. Heavy clouds gathered with little warning before releasing showers that soaked the forest from canopy to ground. Yet rain also belonged to the world Julianne already understood. It was not an unfamiliar threat appearing without explanation, but an ordinary part of rainforest ecology. Moisture nourished the towering trees, replenished streams, and sustained one of the richest ecosystems on Earth. Rather than interpreting every rainfall as an extraordinary danger, her upbringing had taught her that changing weather represented a normal rhythm of the environment. This familiarity did not eliminate hardship, but reduced the fear that often accompanies unfamiliar surroundings. Humidity remained almost constant. Clothing rarely became completely dry beneath the dense canopy. Warm air carried the scent of vegetation and damp earth throughout the day, while mist often lingered among the trees during the morning hours. Insects formed another continuous presence. Their sounds filled nearly every quiet moment, creating a background unlike anything experienced in most cities. For someone encountering the Amazon for the first time, this constant chorus might have seemed overwhelming. Julianne, however, had spent enough time at Panguana to recognize that these sounds generally reflected the ordinary activity of the rainforest rather than immediate danger. Later accounts suggest that this familiarity helped her avoid unnecessary panic. The forest remained challenging, but it was not mysterious in every respect. She understood that countless living creatures shared the environment, each following natural patterns established long before humans arrived. Birds announced themselves from high branches. Frogs called from wet areas as daylight faded. Insects produced an almost uninterrupted rhythm that changed subtly between day and night. These sounds became part of the landscape through which she moved rather than signs of unseen monsters or exaggerated threats. Responsible historical storytelling requires preserving this distinction because the Amazon is extraordinary without transforming its wildlife into fiction. Julianne's parents had taught her to respect animals instead of fearing them indiscriminately. That perspective quietly influenced the way she interpreted the world around her. As hours became days, uncertainty remained her constant companion. Every bend in the stream raised the possibility that something important might appear beyond the next stretch of water. Every opening in the vegetation offered the chance of discovering evidence of human activity. Most often, however, the rainforest simply continued. Trees gave way to more trees. Streams joined slightly larger streams before continuing through dense forest. Time became increasingly difficult to measure beneath the canopy, where direct sunlight rarely reached the ground. The passage of day depended less upon clocks than upon changing light, bird activity, and the gradual arrival of evening sounds. At several points during these early days, Julianne reportedly heard aircraft overhead. The distant sound of engines represented hope unlike anything else she encountered. Search operations had indeed begun following the disappearance of Flight 508, and later records confirm that rescue aircraft attempted to locate survivors. Yet hearing an airplane and being seen from beneath the dense Amazon canopy were entirely different matters. The available evidence indicates that the towering trees concealed much of the forest floor from observers above. Julianne could hear aircraft passing somewhere overhead, but the sound gradually faded without producing immediate rescue. Those moments carried profound uncertainty. She knew people were searching somewhere, yet no visible sign suggested they could identify her exact location beneath the nearly continuous green canopy. The experience reinforced an increasingly practical conclusion. Remaining close to an unknown point in the forest offered no assurance that rescuers would find her. Continuing downstream still represented the clearest strategy available. This realization did not emerge from dramatic declarations, but from observation supported by experience. The rainforest itself continued providing the only consistent direction she possessed. Looking back many years later, Julianne often emphasized how much of her decision-making reflected habits learned from her parents rather than extraordinary courage. Scientists working in remote environments develop routines based upon careful observation, patience, and respect for natural systems. Those routines quietly shaped her responses under circumstances no family could ever have anticipated. She continued drinking from the stream, preserving the small amount of candy she had found, and moving carefully through rain, humidity, branches, and dense vegetation. Each mile remained uncertain. Each day presented new challenges. Yet with every step following the flowing water, Julianne placed greater distance between herself and the unknown location where her journey through the Amazon had begun, trusting that somewhere beyond the endless forest, the stream would eventually lead toward a place where human presence might finally appear. As the days continued, the narrow stream that had first offered Julianne Koepka's sense of direction gradually became wider and more substantial. The change was subtle at first. Small channels merged together, the current became steadier, and the water occupied more space between the dense walls of vegetation. The pattern confirmed what her parents had taught her years earlier during scientific work around Panguana Biological Station. Water rarely remained isolated. It gathered strength as it moved downhill, joining larger waterways that connected distant parts of the rainforest. Julianne could not know where this particular stream would eventually lead, but each widening bend suggested that she was following a logical path rather than wandering without purpose. The available evidence indicates that she alternated between walking along the banks and moving directly through the shallow water whenever dense vegetation made progress on land more difficult. Walking inside the stream reduced the need to force her way through tangled undergrowth and avoided some of the obstacles created by fallen branches and thick plants. The rainforest constantly presented choices rather than obvious solutions. Every route required compromise. Remaining on dry ground often meant slower movement through dense vegetation. Entering the water demanded careful balance while protecting already tired muscles and conserving energy. Later accounts describe Julianne adapting continuously instead of following a rigid plan. She responded to the landscape as it changed, allowing the terrain itself to determine the safest practical route forward. Hunger gradually became a more persistent companion. The small amount of candy she had reportedly found near scattered wreckage could not sustain her indefinitely. The historical record does not describe miraculous discoveries of abundant food or dramatic hunting successes. Instead, the available evidence portrays a young woman who accepted increasing physical weakness while continuing to move. Her objective remained remarkably simple: reach the next stretch of water, continue downstream, avoid unnecessary risks. In survival situations, reducing complex problems into manageable decisions often becomes more important than attempting to solve every challenge at once. Although Julianne never presented her experience as a lesson in survival psychology, her actions reflected exactly that principle. She did not attempt to predict the entire journey. She concentrated on the next practical step. Exhaustion accumulated slowly rather than arriving all at once. Every mile required careful movement. Every uneven surface demanded attention because a careless fall would only reduce her ability to continue. The historical evidence indicates that she remained aware of her physical condition and avoided unnecessary strain whenever possible. Responsible historical accounts do not portray her as fearless or unaffected by fatigue. Instead, they suggest a disciplined effort to preserve the ability to keep moving despite growing weakness. The rainforest imposed its own schedule regardless of human intentions. Tropical rain arrived without consultation, sometimes falling heavily enough to transform the surrounding landscape within a short period. Streams responded quickly, vegetation dripped continuously, and the already humid air became even heavier. Rather than measuring the day by clocks or calendars, Julianne increasingly experienced time through changes in weather, light, and the sounds of the forest. Morning bird activity differed from evening calls. Rain altered the rhythm of movement. Diminishing daylight gradually limited visibility beneath the canopy. Nature itself became the only reliable measure of passing time. Sleeping offered little opportunity for complete recovery. The rainforest remained active throughout the night. Countless insects continued their constant chorus. Frogs announced themselves from nearby pools of water. Occasional sounds moved through the vegetation beyond immediate view. None of these noises necessarily indicated danger. Many represented the ordinary life of one of the world's richest ecosystems. Julianne's childhood experiences at Panguana helped her recognize that distinction. Someone unfamiliar with the Amazon might have interpreted every unfamiliar sound as an immediate threat. Years spent accompanying her parents during scientific fieldwork had taught her otherwise. The forest was alive every hour of the day. Activity itself did not automatically signal danger. That understanding likely reduced unnecessary panic, allowing limited energy to be reserved for decisions that genuinely mattered. Her upbringing continued influencing practical choices in quiet ways. Maria Koepke's careful observation of birds and Hans Wilhelm Koepke's zoological work had never been intended as survival instruction, yet both parents consistently emphasized paying attention to the environment before reacting. Julianne later described learning to observe rivers, weather, plants, and animals as interconnected parts of the same landscape. During these difficult days, those habits remained available even when many other certainties had disappeared. She did not need to invent complicated strategies. She simply continued reading the landscape as she had been taught through years of scientific exposure. The direction of flowing water remained constant. The shape of the banks revealed changing terrain. Dense vegetation suggested where progress might become slower. Open sections of stream offered temporary relief from forcing a path through thick undergrowth. These are not dramatic discoveries. They were practical observations accumulated one after another. The available evidence suggests that this disciplined simplicity became one of her greatest strengths. Instead of allowing uncertainty to multiply into paralysis, she focused upon one consistent objective that never changed. Continue. Downstream, every completed stretch of water created the possibility of reaching a larger one. Every larger waterway increased, at least in theory, the likelihood of eventually encountering signs of human activity. She possessed no map confirming that outcome. She relied instead upon geographical principles that had proven reliable throughout the Amazon for generations. At times, distant aircraft could still be heard somewhere above the rainforest. Historical records confirm that search operations continued during this period, although the exact location of the crash site itself remained uncertain during the early stages of the investigation. Julianne, however, could not know the scope or progress of those efforts. From her perspective beneath the canopy, the occasional sound of an airplane represented possibility rather than certainty. The engines eventually faded into the distance without revealing where the aircraft had been or whether anyone aboard had seen the forest below. As those moments repeated, the available evidence suggests that Julianne increasingly accepted a practical reality. Help might not arrive from the sky before she reached it on the ground. This acceptance did not represent surrender. Instead, it reflected adaptation. Waiting for circumstances beyond her control offered fewer possibilities than continuing along the only direction the rainforest consistently provided. Modern survival specialists often emphasize the importance of maintaining realistic objectives under prolonged stress. Yet Julianne did not possess such formal training. Her response emerged naturally from observation, patience, and habits formed through years within a scientific family. The rainforest remained both obstacle and guide. Rain complicated movement while replenishing the stream she followed. Dense vegetation slowed progress while protecting waterways from disappearing. Countless natural sounds reminded her that the forest was functioning according to its own enduring rhythms, independent of human plans. Day after day, she continued alternating between walking along the banks and wading through the widening stream, conserving strength whenever possible, resisting the temptation to abandon her direction, and trusting that understanding the landscape offered a greater chance of survival than fear ever could, even though no visible sign yet suggested how close or how distant another human being might actually be. By the time Julianne Coep had spent many days following the waterways of the Peruvian Amazon, the steady routine that had carried her forward began to reveal subtle but important changes in the landscape. The stream she had trusted from the beginning had gradually expanded into a broader waterway, whose banks showed signs of being shaped not only by nature, but also by occasional human use. The current appeared stronger. Fallen logs rested in patterns suggesting they had been moved at different times, and the surrounding vegetation no longer seemed entirely untouched. None of these observations guaranteed that people were nearby, yet together they represented something Julianne had not encountered since awakening beneath the rainforest canopy. According to later accounts and her own memoir, these small details encouraged her to continue because they suggested that the waterway had become part of a route used by others. The lessons learned during childhood at Panguana Biological Station had always emphasized that larger rivers served as the practical highways of the Amazon. Communities, researchers, fishermen, and forest workers frequently depended upon them because dense rainforest made overland travel slow and unpredictable. Reaching a larger waterway, therefore, increased the possibility that someone might eventually appear. It did not promise immediate rescue, but it transformed possibility into something more tangible than hope alone. As Julianne continued downstream, she eventually noticed unmistakable evidence of human activity. Near the edge of the river stood a simple shelter used by local forest workers. Nearby was a small boat. After days surrounded only by the natural patterns of the rainforest, these objects represented the first clear indication that people regularly visited the area. The available evidence indicates that the shelter was unoccupied when she arrived. No voices answered. No movement suggested that its owners were nearby at that particular moment. Even so, the discovery changed the nature of her situation completely. For the first time since awakening alone, she no longer depended entirely upon finding signs hidden within the landscape. She had reached a place created by people. Later accounts describe Julianne recognizing that those who used the shelter would likely return, rather than continuing immediately into the unknown. Remaining there offered the greatest opportunity she had yet encountered. The decision reflected the same practical reasoning that had guided her throughout the journey. She had followed flowing water because geography suggested it would increase the likelihood of finding people. Now that she had found clear evidence of human presence, continuing past it would have made little sense. Historical sources also indicate that she found a small quantity of supplies at the shelter. Among them was fuel that she reportedly used to clean an area affected during the long journey through the rainforest. Responsible historical accounts describe this action in restrained terms, recognizing it as a practical measure rather than dramatizing physical hardship. The available evidence does not support sensational descriptions. Instead, it demonstrates Julianne's continued habit of responding calmly to immediate problems using whatever limited resources were available. Even after many difficult days, her actions remained guided by practical observation rather than panic. Time passed as she waited beside the shelter, uncertain whether anyone would return or how long that wait might become. Every sound carried new significance. The familiar chorus of insects and birds continued as always, yet now another possibility existed. At any moment, the ordinary sounds of the rainforest might be joined by evidence that people were approaching along the river. According to later accounts, that moment eventually arrived. Local forest workers returned to the shelter and encountered a teenage girl who had somehow appeared alone in one of the most remote environments in Peru. The historical record suggests that they initially struggled to understand what they were. Seeing a young woman emerging after many days in the rainforest was itself extraordinary. Learning that she identified herself as a passenger from the missing Lanza Flight 508 transformed astonishment into urgent action. Responsible historical sources avoid embellishing these first moments with invented conversations. The exact words exchanged were not preserved with certainty, and it would be inaccurate to reconstruct dialogue that no reliable record confirms. What is well documented is the response that followed. The local workers provided Julianne with water and assistance, recognizing that she required help after her prolonged journey through the rainforest. Their actions became the essential final link in one of history's most remarkable documented survival stories. Without their willingness to help immediately, the outcome might have unfolded very differently. They did far more than simply discover her. They completed the rescue. The available evidence indicates that the workers transported Julianne by river toward medical assistance and the opportunity to establish communication with the authorities. This stage of the story is sometimes overlooked because public attention often focuses on the 11-day walk itself. Yet the historical record makes clear that Julianne did not literally emerge from the rainforest onto a city street entirely on her own. Her extraordinary journey ended when she reached a human camp where local people recognized the situation, offered practical assistance, and carried her the remaining distance back to safety. Their knowledge of the rivers and their readiness to act formed an indispensable part of the rescue. As the boat traveled along the waterway, the landscape that had defined Julianne's world for nearly 2 weeks slowly began to change. The endless uncertainty of choosing each next step gave way to the reassurance that someone else now shared responsibility for the journey. She no longer needed to determine which bend in the river to follow or whether the next stretch of forest concealed another obstacle. Others now guided the route. Modern readers sometimes imagine survival stories ending with a dramatic solitary arrival, but Julianne's experience reflects something more authentic. Individual determination carried her through the rainforest, yet the final return to safety depended upon human kindness local knowledge, and the willingness of strangers to help someone in need. That combination of resilience and compassion forms one of the most enduring aspects of the historical record. As news gradually reached officials responsible for the ongoing search, an extraordinary possibility became reality. A passenger from a missing flight had survived against overwhelming odds. Investigators, medical personnel, journalists, and eventually people around the world would seek to understand how such an outcome had been possible. Many questions still remained unanswered, and some aspects of the event would continue to be studied for decades. Yet one fact no longer belonged to uncertainty. After approximately 11 days following the waterways of the Peruvian Amazon, Julianne Coep had reached people who brought her back from the rainforest, closing the remarkable journey that had begun beneath the silent green canopy on Christmas Day. With Julianne Coep safely returned from the rainforest, the question that captured worldwide attention was no longer whether she had survived, but how such a sequence of events could have been possible. Even more than half a century later, researchers, aviation specialists, journalists, and historians continue examining the remarkable circumstances surrounding her experience. The historical record provides important pieces of the puzzle, yet it also establishes clear limits. Some aspects are supported by first-hand testimony, investigative findings, and physical evidence. Others remain impossible to reconstruct with complete certainty. Responsible historical storytelling, therefore, requires distinguishing between documented fact and informed analysis rather than presenting speculation as established truth. One fact is well supported by multiple reliable sources. Julianne descended approximately 10,000 feet while still attached to a row of passenger seats after the aircraft broke apart during severe weather. She later regained consciousness beneath the Amazon rainforest canopy. Exactly how every second of that descent unfolded can never be known with certainty because no complete observational record exists. Investigators could examine physical evidence and survivor testimony, but no one observed the entire sequence directly. As a result, later analysis focuses on factors that may have reduced the force of descent rather than claiming a single definitive explanation. One frequently discussed factor involves the row of seats itself. The available evidence indicates that Julianne remained attached to 3 connected passenger seats during the descent. Aviation specialists have suggested that this unusual configuration may have altered the way air resistance acted upon her compared with a person falling alone. Some analyses propose that the seats could have increased drag or changed the overall movement through the air. Others note that the structure may have contributed to a slower or less direct descent under certain conditions. Investigators, however, could not determine the exact aerodynamic behavior with certainty, and responsible accounts avoid presenting any single model as proven fact. Another possibility discussed by researchers concerns rotation during the descent. Later accounts sometimes describe the seat section turning as it moved through open air. If such rotation occurred in a particular way, some analysts suggest that it might have affected the speed or orientation of the descent. Yet once again, no complete evidence exists that allows every movement to be reconstructed. The record suggests possibilities rather than certainty. Weather conditions themselves have also received considerable attention. Flight 508 entered severe storm activity over the Peruvian Amazon, including lightning and intense atmospheric instability reported by Julianne in later interviews. Meteorologists and aviation specialists have occasionally considered whether powerful vertical air currents within the storm may have influenced portions of the descent. Such ideas remain plausible subjects for scientific discussion, but investigators ultimately acknowledged that the precise interaction between weather and the descending seat assembly cannot be determined with complete confidence. Beneath the storm, the rainforest introduced another set of variables. Unlike an open field, the Amazon presents an immense layered canopy formed by countless branches, leaves, and intertwined vegetation extending from towering trees toward the forest floor. Some researchers have suggested that successive layers of vegetation may have absorbed portions of the remaining energy before Julianne reached the ground. Branches bending rather than breaking instantly, dense foliage, and the characteristics of the forest floor have all been discussed as contributing factors that might have helped reduce the overall impact. Yet none of these elements alone explains the outcome. Millions of trees exist throughout the Amazon, but they do not transform similar circumstances into predictable, survivable events. The historical record instead points toward an extraordinarily uncommon combination of conditions occurring simultaneously. This distinction is essential. No single factor guarantees survival from such a descent. Not the seeds alone, not the storm alone, not the canopy alone, not the forest floor alone. The available evidence indicates that multiple rare circumstances may have interacted in ways investigators could never completely reconstruct. Chance undoubtedly formed part of the equation. So did the physical environment. So did factors that remain unknown because they left no measurable record. Rather than diminishing Julianne's experience, this uncertainty reminds us how exceptional it truly was. If the first half of the story asks how she reached the rainforest alive, the second half rests upon evidence that is considerably stronger. Once Julianne awakened beneath the canopy, the decisions she made over the following 11 days are documented through her own consistent testimony and supported by what is known about the Amazon environment. Unlike the descent itself, these actions can be understood through practical observation rather than mystery. Her childhood provided the first advantage. Growing up between Lima and Panguana Biological Station meant that the rainforest was not an unfamiliar world. She recognized many of its ordinary sounds. Birds, frogs, insects, rainfall, and flowing water belonged to an environment she had experienced repeatedly while accompanying her parents during scientific work. This familiarity did not remove danger, but reduced unnecessary panic. Instead of interpreting every sound as a threat, she could recognize much of the rainforest as functioning according to natural patterns. The second crucial factor involved direction. Hans Wilhelm Koepke and Maria Koepke had taught their daughter practical lessons rooted in geography rather than survival mythology. Water flows downhill. Small streams become larger streams. Larger streams connect with rivers that people often use for transportation, work, and settlement throughout the Amazon basin. By following moving water downstream instead of wandering randomly through dense vegetation, Julianne transformed an overwhelming wilderness into a navigable system. She did not know where the water would lead, but she understood that the landscape itself provided guidance. Drinking from the streams represented another practical decision supported by the environment she already understood. Conserving energy became equally important. Rather than attempting impossible distances each day, she maintained a steady pace that respected her physical limitations. The available evidence consistently suggests that she avoided unnecessary risks whenever possible, adapting her movement to the terrain instead of fighting against it. Perhaps just as important was the psychological discipline reflected in her actions. Julianne did not attempt to solve every problem at once. Her objective remained simple and consistent. Continue downstream. Read the landscape. Watch for signs of people. This narrowed focus prevented uncertainty from becoming paralysis. Each completed bend in the river led naturally to the next one. 11 days of persistence emerged not from dramatic heroics, but from repeating manageable decisions under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Eventually, those decisions brought visible evidence of human activity. She reached a riverside shelter used by local forest workers, recognized that people would likely return, and remain there instead of continuing deeper into uncertainty. When the workers arrived, they provided the assistance that completed the rescue. Their role cannot be separated from the story's outcome. Julianne survived the walk through the rainforest, but she did not simply emerge alone onto a city street. Local people recognized her situation, offered water and practical help, transported her by river, and connected her with medical care and the authorities. Their knowledge of the region and their willingness to act transformed survival into rescue. Looking back across the entire sequence of events, the historical evidence points not toward a supernatural explanation or an invincible individual, but toward an extraordinary convergence of rare circumstances. An uncommon combination of physical factors may have made survival from the descent possible, although investigators could never explain every detail with certainty. Once on the ground, however, childhood familiarity with the rainforest, practical geographical knowledge, disciplined decision-making, careful conservation of energy, persistent movement over approximately 11 days, the unpredictable role of chance, and the essential compassion of local forest workers combined to produce one of the most remarkable documented survival stories in modern history. After nearly 2 weeks in the Peruvian Amazon, Julianne Coep's journey entered a new chapter that unfolded not in the silence of the rainforest, but among doctors, investigators, family members, and eventually the attention of the wider world. Medical care began soon after local forest workers brought her out of the jungle by river. Contemporary reports and later accounts describe a careful recovery, during which physicians documented her condition and monitored her progress. Responsible historical descriptions focus less on dramatic detail than on the remarkable fact that a 17-year-old who had endured such extraordinary circumstances was now able to begin healing. The greater story was no longer simply about endurance in the rainforest. It had become part of a broader effort to understand one of the most unusual survival cases in aviation history. One of the most meaningful moments following her rescue was her reunion with her father, Hans Wilhelm Coep. Only days earlier, he had expected to welcome his wife and daughter to Panguana for Christmas. Instead, he had spent those days confronting uncertainty while search operations continued across an immense region of the Amazon. The historical record consistently describes the reunion between father and daughter as deeply significant, bringing together two people who had been separated by events neither could have imagined. Yet even within that reunion existed profound sorrow. As rescue efforts and investigations progressed, it became clear that Maria Coep and the other occupants of Flight 508 did not return. Responsible historical accounts present this reality with respect rather than sensationalism. The loss affected families across Peru and beyond, reminding the public that behind every aviation investigation are individual lives, relationships, and futures forever changed. According to reliable historical sources, Julianne later assisted investigators by providing information that contributed to locating the crash area. Her memory of the surrounding landscape and the route she had followed through the rainforest became valuable as authorities worked to understand what had happened. The available evidence indicates that her first-hand knowledge helped support the broader investigation, although the exact contribution has been described with varying levels of detail across different sources. What remains clear is that Julianne did not simply disappear from public view after her rescue. She became an important witness whose experience provided investigators with information unavailable from any other source. International media quickly recognized the extraordinary nature of the story. Newspapers, magazines, television programs, and later documentaries introduced millions of people to the account of the young survivor who had walked through the Amazon after descending approximately 10,000 feet while attached to a row of passenger seats. Public fascination often centered upon the apparent impossibility of the event. Yet, Julianne herself consistently approached those questions with restraint. Rather than presenting herself as someone possessing extraordinary powers or supernatural protection, she repeatedly emphasized the combination of unusual circumstances, practical knowledge, persistence, and chance reflected in the historical record. Over the years, she also spoke openly about another aspect of survival that receives less public attention. Later interviews and her memoir describe feelings that have often been understood as survivor guilt. She reflected upon the reality that she had lived while so many others had not. These reflections emerged gradually through decades of thoughtful conversation rather than dramatic public declarations. Responsible historical storytelling recognizes them as deeply personal experiences expressed by Julianne herself, rather than emotions to be exaggerated or interpreted beyond what she chose to share. Her willingness to discuss these feelings has contributed to a broader understanding of the psychological complexity that can accompany survival after catastrophic events. Instead of allowing the defining experience of her youth to determine every aspect of her future, Julianne continued along a path remarkably consistent with the values that had shaped her childhood. She pursued higher education in biology, following the scientific traditions established by both of her parents. Rather than turning away from the rainforest that had become forever associated with both profound loss and extraordinary survival, she chose to continue studying and protecting the natural world they had devoted their lives to understanding. This decision remains one of the most meaningful dimensions of her story. It reflects continuity rather than escape, purpose rather than retreat. In time, Julianne became closely involved with Panguana Biological Station, the research center her parents had helped establish in the Peruvian rainforest. The station continued serving as a place for scientific investigation, ecological observation, and international cooperation. Researchers from multiple disciplines visited to study one of the most biologically diverse environments on Earth, contributing to knowledge about birds, mammals, insects, plants, and countless ecological relationships. Julianne's work helped ensure that Panguana remained not merely a symbol of family history, but an active center for scientific research and conservation. Her efforts extended beyond scientific investigation alone. The available evidence indicates that Panguana developed through cooperation with neighboring communities whose knowledge of the rainforest formed an essential part of living and working responsibly within the region. Conservation succeeds most effectively when scientific research and local experience support one another rather than existing separately. This principle reflected values that had long guided the Coep family's work in Peru. The rainforest itself deserved understanding because of its ecological importance, not simply because of the remarkable survival story connected to it. Looking across the decades, it becomes clear that Julianne's life cannot be understood only through the 11 days she spent following waterways beneath the Amazon canopy. Those days formed an extraordinary chapter, but they did not define the entirety of her contribution. She became a biologist, an advocate for rainforest conservation, a steward of Panguana, and an important voice preserving an accurate historical account of what happened during Christmas of 1971. She consistently encouraged respect for evidence, acknowledging what could be supported by documentation while accepting that certain aspects of the event would never be fully explained. That approach reflected the scientific values taught by Maria and Hans Wilhelm Long before the journey that changed everything. Perhaps the deepest meaning of Julianne Coep's story lies not in a single extraordinary moment, but in the relationship between humanity and the natural world. The Amazon rainforest became the setting of unimaginable loss, yet also provided the geographical patterns, flowing waterways, ecological familiarity, and environmental conditions that helped preserve her life. The same forest that witnessed tragedy also offered the path that led toward rescue. Years later, instead of viewing the rainforest only as the place where disaster occurred, Julianne dedicated herself to protecting it through scientific research and conservation. In doing so, she continued the work begun by her parents, ensuring that future generations would see the Amazon not merely as a distant wilderness or the backdrop to an astonishing survival story, but as one of Earth's most valuable ecosystems worthy of careful study, thoughtful stewardship, and enduring respect. Her journey, therefore, stands as more than a remarkable historical account. It is a testament to the power of knowledge, resilience, compassion, scientific curiosity, and a quiet determination to transform profound personal loss into a lifelong commitment that continues benefiting both people and the rainforest that forever shaped her life.